The laundry hung stiff on Martha Calloway's line, dripping mountain water onto red clay and glowing pale blue in the August dark. What came next would force Washington to classify an entire valley, bury medical files under national security, and leave a graveyard that still clicks like a broken clock. It was late summer, 1953, when families along Harlan Creek in eastern Kentucky first noticed the strangeness. The hollow sat narrow and steep, hemmed by ridges thick with hickory and oak, far enough from any county seat that mail came twice a week, and the nearest doctor lived an hour's mule ride away. Folks drew water from the creek, boiled their greens in it, scrubbed their children's faces with it. The creek ran cold and clear over limestone, fed by springs that had never gone dry, not even in the drought of '47. Then the power station went up. They called it a power station. Federal men arrived in May of that year with blueprints and concrete mixers, cordoned off 12 acres upstream where the hollow pinched tight, and built a low cinder block structure with no windows and a single steel door. No power lines ran out. No coal trucks rumbled in. The only traffic was a dark sedan every third Wednesday and a tanker truck with no markings that came monthly after midnight. When Ezra Goins, who trapped muskrat along the upper creek, asked what kind of power it made, the foreman handed him a $20 bill and told him to mind his own tobacco. By late July, the water started tasting different. Metallic, faintly bitter, like licking a battery post. Cows quit drinking from the lower pastures. Then came the laundry. Martha Calloway hung her husband's work shirts on a Tuesday, and when she stepped outside after supper to bring them in, the fabric shimmered faint blue in the twilight. She thought her eyes were failing until her daughter pointed and whispered, "Mama, they're shining." Martha wasn't alone. Within a week, clotheslines up and down the hollow glowed softly after dusk. Quilts, bed linens, children's dungarees. The women gathered at the general store, voices low, and discovered every one of them washed in creek water. Some tried well water. The glow faded. Most had no choice. Wells cost money they didn't have. Then the bell cracked. The church sat on a knoll above the creek, white clapboard with a tin steeple and a bronze bell cast in 1892. On Sunday morning, August 16th, Reverend Hobbs climbed the narrow ladder to ring the call to worship, standard practice, same as 50 years prior. But before his hand touched the rope, the bell fractured down the middle with a sound like a rifle shot. The crack ran clean through, splitting the inscription "In memory of our beloved dead." No rust, no prior damage. The bronze had simply failed. 2 days later, the federal men came back. Not the construction crew, different men, in suits too heavy for the season, carrying black cases and instruments with dials. They walked the creek bank, held wands over the water, scribbled in notebooks. They did not speak to anyone. When Lloyd Tipton approached to ask what they were measuring, one man turned and said only, "Stay indoors after dark." No explanation, no reassurance. That night, a dozen families saw lights inside the power station, not electric bulbs, but a cold, wavering glow that pulsed through seams in the concrete. Some said it looked like heat lightning trapped in a jar. Others swore they heard a hum, low and throbbing, that made their teeth ache. September brought the doctors. They arrived in a canvas-topped army truck, set up a field clinic in the schoolhouse, and examined every person in the hollow. Blood draws, urine samples, X-rays from a portable machine that clicked and whirred. They wrote nothing down in front of the patients, just nodded and moved to the next. When Nadine Fletcher asked what they were testing for, the doctor smiled and said, Routine health survey, ma'am. Government program. But Nadine had worked as a nurse in Lexington during the war. She recognized the lead aprons. She knew what Geiger counters looked like. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. If this story's already unsettling you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happens next makes glowing laundry look like a blessing. The clinic packed up on a Friday. By Monday, 2 black sedans and a stake bed truck returned to the power station. Men in coveralls carried out filing cabinets, cardboard boxes, metal drums. They worked through the night. At dawn, they lit a bonfire in a steel barrel and fed it papers, binders, folders, loose sheets, until the smoke turned thick and chemical. Then they drove away. The power station sat empty, the door hung open. Inside, nothing remained but concrete walls, anchor bolts in the floor, and a circular stain in the center that looked like rust, but smelled like burnt copper. What did they burn? What couldn't they leave behind? The glow faded from the laundry by October. The creek ran clear again, or at least it looked clear. Families stayed. Where else could they go? Land had been in their names since before the Civil War, but the children stopped playing in the water. The cattle stayed thin. And at night, if you walked past the cemetery on the ridge above the hollow, you could hear it. A ticking. Steady, rhythmic, faster than any pendulum. Not from one grave. From all of them. The dead had started counting something. By winter, 3 families had buried children who'd been healthy in summer. Nobody filed the pattern as suspicious because nobody compared notes. Not officially, not where it could be written down. The first was Samuel Goins, Ezra's grandson, age 7. He'd spent July wading in the shallows, catching crawdads with his bare hands, drinking straight from the creek when his canteen ran dry. By October, he complained of tiredness. By November, he couldn't climb the schoolhouse steps. Doc Brennan drove out from Harlan proper, examined the boy in lamplight, and diagnosed anemia. The child died on Thanksgiving morning, pale as candle wax, his gums bleeding. 2 weeks later, Lily Poteet, age 9, followed the same arc. Fatigue, bruising that wouldn't heal, then a fever that spiked to 105. Her mother, Grace, tried poultices and prayer. The girl died before Christmas, weighing 41 pounds. In January of 1954, it was Thomas Calloway, Martha's youngest, age 6, same progression, same wasting. Doc Brennan drove out again, took one look, and told Martha he was sorry. He didn't say for what. When she pressed, he folded his stethoscope and said he'd seen similar cases during the war, radiation workers at Oak Ridge, but that he'd never told her that, and she shouldn't repeat it. Then he left. Martha wrote to the state health department. She detailed the symptoms, mentioned the power station, the federal doctors, the burned records. She mailed it registered. No reply ever came. Years later, a clerk in Frankfurt would claim the letter was never received. But in 1989, a graduate student researching Appalachian health disparities found the envelope in a box marked "Disposed, no action," stamped with a code that translated to federal jurisdiction, "Do not process." The ticking in the cemetery grew louder. Ezra Goins, driven by grief and rage, walked up to the burial ground one February night with a coal lantern and a pick. He knelt by his grandson's grave, a mound of frozen clay marked by a limestone slab his brother had chiseled, and pressed his ear to the ground. The ticking came from below, rapid and metallic, like a pocket watch wound too tight. He tried another grave, same sound, then another, Every plot placed after 1953 clicked in rhythm, a chorus of small countdowns. Ezra told the others. They went up in pairs, families confirming what their ears already knew. The older graves, those from the 19th century, from the flu epidemic of 1918, lay silent. Only the new dead ticked. The earth was measuring them. Reverend Hobbs, still rattled by the bell's fracture, suggested they dig one up. The congregation recoiled. But Lloyd Tipton, who'd lost a cousin in a mine collapse and knew how bones settled, said he'd do it alone if others kept watch. On a moonless Saturday, 5 men gathered in the cemetery with shovels and a tarp. They chose the grave of Amos Fletcher, Nadine's husband, dead from a heart attack in September. The ground broke hard. 2 feet down, the ticking grew deafening. At 4 feet, Lloyd's shovel hit the coffin lid. He brushed away the clay. The wood looked normal. Pine boards, simple joinery. But when he leaned close, he saw a faint luminescence seeping through the grain, the same pale blue that had glowed in the laundry. The ticking came from inside. Lloyd pried up one corner. The smell that rose wasn't decay. It was ozone, sharp and electric. He slammed the lid back down and told the others to fill it in. No one spoke of it again, not in daylight, but the story spread. By spring, families began leaving, not en masse, just one household a month, slipping away to Harlan or Lexington or out of state entirely, selling land for pennies or abandoning it outright. Those who stayed grew insular, suspicious. When a reporter from the Lexington Herald drove into the Hollow in April to investigate rumors of strange illness, he found doors shut and curtains drawn. The general store owner told him there was no story, never had been, and he should leave before dark. The reporter complied. In June, a second team of federal agents arrived. No instruments this time, just clipboards and cameras. They went door to door, conducting what they called a demographic survey. They asked how many people lived in each home, birth dates, places of work. They photographed every structure, even the outhouses. Then they left. 3 weeks later, the Census Bureau in Washington issued a revised population count for eastern Kentucky. The hamlet of Harlan Creek, previously recorded as home to 83 residents, was listed as uninhabited. The designation was backdated to 1952, before the power station was ever built. Martha Calloway, still living in the Hollow with her surviving children, saw the report at the county clerk's office. She demanded a correction. The clerk shrugged and said the federal government doesn't make mistakes. If the census says nobody lives there, then nobody lives there. Why would they erase a town while people still breathed in it? By autumn of '54, the ticking had migrated. Families reported hearing it inside their homes, beneath floorboards, behind walls, in the crawl spaces under their beds. Nadine Fletcher woke one night to find her late husband's watch on the nightstand ticking in perfect sync with the sound in the walls, even though she'd buried that watch with him. She threw it in the creek. The ticking didn't stop. The children who survived the first wave started showing new symptoms. Nosebleeds that wouldn't clot, teeth loosening in their gums, hair falling out in clumps. Doc Brennan stopped coming. When Martha tracked him down in Harlan, he told her he'd been advised by unnamed authorities that any medical records from the Hollow were now classified under the Atomic Energy Act. The living had become evidence. On November 9, 1954, Harlan Creek reversed its flow for 47 minutes. If the physics of that sounds impossible, the witnesses didn't care. They watched the water climb upstream against gravity, carrying leaves and silt back toward the shuttered power station. Lloyd Tipton saw it first. He'd gone down to check his fish traps at dawn, stepping through frost-stiff grass to the bank where the creek bent around a sandbar. The water was moving wrong. Not slow, not sluggish, actively wrong, flowing uphill with the same steady current it had always carried downhill. He knelt and dropped a stick into the flow. It drifted north, upstream, picking up speed as it went. He ran back to the general store, shouting until others came. By the time a dozen people gathered at the bank, the reversal was undeniable. The creek churned upward, whitecaps forming where it hit rocks. The sound of it all wrong, a sloshing, backward rush that made their inner ears ache. Ezra Goins tried to wade in, thinking maybe his eyes were lying. The current knocked him sideways. The water was cold enough to stop his breath, and it pulled north with enough force to drag a grown man off his feet. Then, at 7:41 a.m., it stopped. The creek went slack, glass still for 30 seconds, before resuming its natural southern flow as if nothing had happened. Nobody called the authorities. What would they say? The federal men had made it clear the hollow didn't exist on paper. Reporting an impossible event from a non-existent town would only invite more erasure, or worse, more attention. But the reversal left a mark. Along the banks where the water had climbed, a residue dried in the morning sun, a fine crystalline powder that glittered faintly even in daylight. Martha Calloway scraped some into a mason jar. Under lamplight, it glowed green. She buried the jar in her root cellar and told no one. That winter brought silence. Not the peaceful kind, the absence kind, the void that presses on your eardrums when something that should make noise stops. The birds left. Crows, sparrows, even the ravens that had nested in the ridge oaks for generations, gone by December. The dogs quit barking. Livestock stood mute in their pens, and when the hogs were slaughtered for winter meat, their lungs were mottled gray and their blood ran thin as water. The hollow was forgetting how to live. Nadine Fletcher, trained as a nurse and stubborn as bedrock, started keeping a journal. She recorded symptoms, dates, names. She sketched a map of the hollow and marked each house where someone had died or fallen ill. The pattern emerged stark and undeniable. The closer a family lived to the creek, the faster the sickness took them. Those on the ridge drawing water from springs that bypassed the main channel suffered less. But even they heard the ticking at night. On January 14th, 1955, Nadine's journal entry read, "Checked the cemetery again. The ticking has changed. No longer steady. Now it speeds and slows, like something breathing. Ezra says the new graves are warm to the touch, even in this cold." I pressed my hand to Samuel's stone. It was, not hot, just blood warm, like flesh. We are living above something that refuses to stay buried. She wasn't wrong. In February, the ground began to shift. Families woke to find cracks in their foundations, hairline fractures that hadn't been there the night before. Sinkholes opened in pastures, small, at first, no bigger than a washtub, but deep enough that when Lloyd dropped a stone into one, he never heard it hit bottom. The sinkholes clustered in a rough circle around the cemetery, as if the earth beneath were hollowing out. Reverend Hobbs, desperate for answers or absolution, wrote to the Atomic Energy Commission. He detailed everything: the power station, the glow, the children, the ticking graves, the backward creek. He mailed it certified, return receipt requested. The receipt came back signed. The letter itself never received a reply. But 2 weeks later, a man in a gray suit arrived at the church. He didn't give his name. He sat in the front pew and waited until the Reverend finished his sermon. Then he walked Hobbs outside, stood close enough that his breath fogged the Reverend's glasses, and said 3 sentences. "Your letter was received and reviewed. The matters you describe fall under national security restrictions. Further correspondence on this subject will be considered an act against the interests of the United States." Then he drove away. Hobbs never wrote another letter, but he kept a carbon copy of the first, hidden inside his family Bible, which his granddaughter would find in 2008 and scan to a forum for declassified Cold War incidents. By then, the AEC had been dissolved for 30 years, and the men who'd issued the threat were dead. The letter gained brief traction online before the forum was quietly taken down, its domain purchased by a shell company registered in Delaware with no listed officers. What were they protecting? Or what were they protecting us from? Spring came late in '55. When the thaw finally arrived in April, the creek ran dark, not muddy but ink-black, opaque as crude oil. Fish floated belly up in the shallows, their scales sloughing off in sheets. The smell was chemical, acrid, like burning plastic mixed with wet copper. No one drank from the creek anymore, but gardens watered with it withered overnight. Tomato plants blackened on the vine. Beanstalks twisted into spirals and grew thorns. Martha Calloway pulled up a potato plant and found the tubers fused together in a lumpy mass, studded with what looked like teeth, small, white, too regular to be natural growths. She burned the entire crop and salted the earth. By summer, only 19 families remained. The general store closed. The schoolhouse sat empty. Reverend Hobbs held services for congregations of 5. The children who were left had stopped growing. Not slowly, they'd simply plateaued, frozen at whatever height and weight they'd been in 1953. Nadine measured her niece every month. The girl stayed 4 feet 2 inches tall for 18 months straight, even as her birth certificate said she should be passing her 12th birthday. The ticking in the cemetery reached a pitch that summer that made the air vibrate. On the longest day of the year, June 21st, it synchronized. Every grave, clicking in perfect unison, a metronome counting down to something no one could name. The dead were waiting for a signal. In August of 1955, Grace Poteet walked into the creek at midnight and didn't come out. Her daughter had been dead 8 months. Her husband had fled to Cincinnati without her, and the thing wearing her daughter's voice had been calling from the woods for 3 straight nights. Grace wasn't the first. Amos Tucker drowned himself in April. His widow said he'd been hearing his name spoken backward. Soma, Soma, whispering from the cellar where he'd stored potatoes. When he went down to investigate, he found his own initials carved into every tuber, fresh cuts that wept clear fluid. He hanged himself from the barn beam that night. By summer's end, 7 people had taken their own lives. The methods varied, but the trigger was always the same. Something spoke to them in a voice they recognized, called them by name or by love, and when they tried to find the source, they discovered evidence of themselves where they shouldn't be. Handwriting they didn't remember producing, photographs they'd never posed for, footprints in their own gait, leading into the woods and never coming back out. Nadine Fletcher documented each case. She noted the pattern. Every victim had lost someone to the sickness first. Every victim reported the same disorientation, time folding back on itself, memories feeling borrowed, the sense that they were being watched by their own future corpses. Doc Brennan, who still lived in Harlan but refused to treat anyone from the Hollow, got drunk one night and told a bartender the truth. He said the federal doctors had measured radiation levels in the children's bone marrow that should have killed them in hours. He said the isotopes didn't match anything on the civilian periodic table. He said one of the doctors, a man from Los Alamos with clearance higher than God, had pulled him aside and said, "This isn't contamination. This is exposure to something that hasn't been isolated yet. The children aren't dying from poison. They're changing into something we don't have a name for." The bartender thought he was raving, but a local journalist overheard, took notes, and tried to investigate. His car went off the road 2 days later on a clear, dry afternoon. The sheriff ruled it an accident. The journalist's notebook was never recovered. What would you do if your child came back wrong? Martha Calloway faced that question in September. She woke to knocking, soft, rhythmic, polite, and found her son Thomas standing on the porch, the son she'd buried 9 months prior. He looked exactly as he had the morning he died, pale, thin, wearing the Sunday clothes she'd dressed him in for the coffin. He smiled and said, "Mama, I'm cold. Can I come in?" She didn't open the door. She gripped the frame and asked, "What are you?" The boy cocked his head. "I'm Thomas. Don't you know me?" "My son is dead. I got better, Mama. It doesn't hurt anymore. Please let me in." Martha's hands shook. Every instinct screamed to unlock the latch, pull him inside, hold him. But she'd seen what happened to families who opened their doors. She'd heard the screams. She said, "If you're my boy, tell me what you whispered to me before you died." The thing on the porch paused. Its smile didn't falter, but something behind its eyes recalculated. Then it said, "You never let me whisper anything, Mama. You were too scared to get close." That was true. Martha had been terrified of contagion in those final hours, had kept a cloth over her face, had touched her son only through blankets. The guilt had gnawed her ever since. The boy stepped closer. "It's okay. I forgive you. Now let me in." Martha slammed the door, shoved a chair against it, and dragged her surviving children to the root cellar. They stayed there until dawn. When she emerged, the boy was gone. But his footprints remained on the porch. Bare feet, child-sized, pressed into wood as if the boards had been soft tar. They weren't haunting the living. They were recruiting. Lloyd Tipton watched it happen to his neighbor, Carl Benson. Carl's wife had died of the sickness in June. 3 months later, she appeared at his window every night, tapping the glass, saying his name. Carl ignored her the first week. By the second, he was talking back. By the third, he'd opened the window. Neighbors found him the next morning, sitting in his kitchen, staring at nothing. He wouldn't speak, wouldn't eat. When they tried to move him, his skin was cold. Not corpse cold, but the deep cold of stone pulled from a river in winter. They left him there. 2 days later, he stood up, walked out the door, and headed toward the cemetery. Lloyd and Ezra followed at a distance. Carl climbed the ridge, stepped between the ticking graves, and lay down in the space his wife's plot should have occupied. Except she'd been buried in the churchyard, not the cemetery. Carl stretched out on bare ground and closed his eyes. Within an hour, the grass around him withered. Within a day, the earth had sunk beneath him. Within a week, a mound had formed, and the ticking had added one more voice to its chorus. No one retrieved the body. What body was there to retrieve? Reverend Hobbs stopped holding services. He sat in the empty church, the cracked bell silent above him, and read scripture aloud to no one. When Nadine came to check on him, she found him copying the same verse over and over on the walls in pencil. The dead know nothing, and they have no more reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. Ecclesiastes chapter 9. He'd written it 412 times. "It's a lie," he told her. "They know everything. They remember everything. And they want us to remember with them." Nadine tried to convince him to leave. He refused. "This is my church. I won't abandon it to them." "To who?" He pointed toward the cemetery. "The congregation that's coming. October, the population of the Hollow had dropped to 11. The federal government maintained its position. Harlan Creek was uninhabited, had been uninhabited, would remain uninhabited. Maps printed that year showed the Hollow as blank space, a cartographic void labeled only with elevation lines. But something was filling that void. Families who remained reported seeing people in the woods, figures that moved wrong, too fluid or too stiff, always at the edge of vision. They wore clothes from the wrong decade. They carried tools that didn't exist yet. One woman swore she saw herself walking past her own window, aged 30 years, mouth moving in speech she couldn't hear. The ticking shifted again. Now it came in waves, surging loud and then dropping to near silence like a pulse. Nadine timed it. The intervals were irregular but rhythmic. 7 seconds, 11 seconds, 13 seconds. Prime numbers. A mathematician she later corresponded with suggested it might be a signal, a countdown, or a mathematical proof of something trying to communicate through the only medium it had: the bones of the dead. The earth was learning to speak. On March 3, 1956, the Army came back with bulldozers and a mandate nobody was allowed to read. This time they weren't pretending it was about power or surveys. They came to erase the Hollow from the ground up. The convoy rolled in at dawn. 6 trucks, 2 bulldozers, a command trailer, and 37 men in fatigues with no unit insignia. They set up a perimeter at the mouth of the Hollow, strung wire fence across the single road, and posted guards with rifles. A captain whose nameplate read only J. Werner knocked on the first door he came to, Lloyd Tipton's farmhouse, and delivered a mimeographed notice. By order of the Department of Defense, all structures within the designated area are to be demolished for purposes of national security. Residents are instructed to vacate within 72 hours. Compliance is mandatory. Compensation will be arranged through federal channels. Lloyd read it twice. "What designated area?" "This one," Werner said, gesturing vaguely at the hills. "This is my land. My grandfather homesteaded this land in 1870. "Not anymore." Werner's face showed no emotion. "You have 72 hours. And if we don't leave..." Werner looked at him for a long moment. "Then you'll be removed." The Army delivered the same notice to all 11 remaining families. No appeals process, no legal recourse. Just an evacuation order backed by armed men and machinery. Nadine Fletcher, still keeping her journal, wrote, "They're not even pretending we exist. We have no rights here because officially, we were never here. Who do you appeal to when you've been erased from the record?" Most families packed what they could carry and left that first day. Ezra Goins, who'd buried his grandson in the ticking cemetery, refused. He sat on his porch with a shotgun across his knees and told the soldiers he'd been born in that house, and he'd die in it. They didn't argue. They just waited. Martha Calloway gathered her children and tried to leave, but when she reached the perimeter fence, the guards turned her back. "No exit until demolition is complete," they said. She asked why. They didn't answer. She asked to speak to Werner. He sent word. All residents must remain in the area until the operation concludes. Federal security protocol. So the families who wanted to flee were trapped, and the families who wanted to stay were condemned. Classic bureaucratic horror. The the cage that locks from both sides. The demolition began on March 5th. The bulldozers started with the structures farthest from the cemetery, the general store, the schoolhouse, abandoned homes on the southern edge. They pushed buildings into piles, splintered wood and shattered glass, then doused everything with diesel and burned it. The smoke rose black and chemical, visible for miles. Residents in Harlan proper saw it and asked questions. The sheriff told them it was controlled agricultural burning. Nobody believed him, but nobody investigated. As the bulldozers worked closer to the center of the hollow, the machinery started failing. Engines seized, hydraulic lines burst. On the second day, one dozer rolled forward on its own while the operator was outside the cab, crushed a stack of lumber, and didn't stop until it hit a tree and the engine block cracked. The operator swore he'd set the brake and pulled the key. The hollow was defending itself. By the third day, the soldiers were visibly rattled. 2 men reported seeing faces in the smoke. Not vague shapes, but detailed human faces, mouths open, screaming without sound. Another claimed his rifle discharged on its own, the safety still engaged, the bullet passing through a window of the church and striking the cracked bell hard enough to make it ring one last, broken note. Werner ordered his men to push through. They reached the cemetery on March 7th. The graves had changed. The mounds were taller now, built up from beneath as if something were surfacing. The ticking had stopped entirely, not faded, but stopped, like a held breath. The headstones were warm enough to steam in the cold air, and carved into the back of each stone, in letters that hadn't been there a month prior, were dates. Not death dates, but future dates. Dates ranging from 1957 to 2003. Nadine, watching from her window, wrote, "They're not graves anymore. They're appointments." Werner ordered the cemetery bulldozed. The operator refused. Werner drew his sidearm and repeated the order. The operator climbed into the cab, lowered the blade, and pushed forward. The blade struck the first headstone. Samuel Goins died November 1953, and the stone didn't budge. The dozer's engine screamed, treads chewing dirt, but the stone stood firm. Then the ground beneath the dozer collapsed. The machine dropped 8 feet in an instant, the operator thrown clear, and from the hole rose a sound like wind through a tunnel, except the wind was hot and carried voices. The soldiers backed away. Werner shouted for them to hold position, but 3 men dropped their rifles and ran. The hole kept widening, a sinkhole spreading in a perfect circle around the cemetery, swallowing graves, headstones, the entire ridge. And from below came light. Not firelight, not daylight, pale blue light, the same glow that had shone in the laundry 2 years prior, now pouring up from the earth like a searchlight aimed at heaven. Werner radioed for air support. Within an hour, a helicopter arrived with a man in civilian clothes carrying a black case. He conferred with Werner, then walked to the edge of the sinkhole and opened the case. Inside was a device covered in dials and a probe on a cord. He lowered the probe into the hole. The needle on the device pegged instantly, beyond the highest marking. The man pulled the probe back, closed the case, and walked directly to the helicopter without speaking to anyone. As the helicopter lifted off, Werner received new orders by radio. Nadine was close enough to hear fragments. Containment impossible. Recommend full evacuation. Scorched earth protocol authorized. What couldn't they contain? What scared them enough to burn it all? The army pulled out the next morning. No explanation, no goodbye. They loaded the trucks, abandoned the bulldozers, and drove away. The perimeter fence stayed up, but the guards were gone. The families that remained, Ezra, Nadine, Martha and her children, Lloyd and 4 others, stood in the road and watched the dust settle. Then they turned toward the cemetery. The sinkhole had stopped growing. The light from below had dimmed, but not died. And from deep in that shaft, something was climbing. Not quickly, not frantically, but with the steady, deliberate rhythm of something that had been waiting a long time and knew exactly where it was going. They'd opened the door. Now something was coming through. The first thing that emerged wasn't a body, it was a sound. A voice, clear as Sunday morning church bells, singing a hymn the hollow hadn't heard in 2 years. "Shall we gather at the river?" It was Lily Poteet's voice, the 9-year-old who died in December of '53, and she sang every word perfectly, even though she'd been buried before learning the final verse. Nadine Fletcher stood at the edge of the sinkhole, 50 feet from the light, and felt her legs go weak. The voice echoed up from the shaft with unnatural clarity. No distortion, no fading, as if the child were standing in a concert hall, not buried under 8 feet of collapsed earth and limestone. Other voices joined in harmony. Adult voices, men's voices, a chorus rising from below, singing words that had been spoken over their graves, prayers that had been whispered into their coffins. Lloyd Tipton grabbed Nadine's arm. "We need to leave. Now." But Ezra Goen stepped closer to the edge. "That's my grandson. I know his voice." "That's not your grandson," Lloyd said. "Whatever that is, it's not him." Ezra didn't listen. He knelt at the rim of the hole and called down, "Samuel, Samuel, can you hear me?" The singing stopped. Silence pressed down like a weight. Then a child's voice, small and uncertain. "Grandpa?" Ezra's face crumpled. "I'm here, boy. I'm right here." "I'm cold, Grandpa. It's so cold down here." I know. Can you climb up? Can you come to me?" A pause. Then, "I don't think I'm supposed to." "Why not?" "Because I'm not finished yet." Before Ezra could respond, something moved in the light below. A shape, human-sized, ascending. Not climbing, rising, as if carried on an elevator. The blue glow intensified, outlining a figure in silhouette. Small frame, child proportions, arms at its sides. As it rose closer, details emerged. Clothing rotted to threads. Skin the color of tallow. Eyes open but reflecting no light. Black as the bottom of a well. It was Samuel Goins. And it was not. The thing reached the surface and stepped onto solid ground with a movement too smooth. Joints bending in ways that suggested the bones inside had become something more flexible. It turned its head toward Ezra with mechanical precision. "Hi, Grandpa." Ezra reached out. Lloyd tackled him sideways, knocking him away from the child. The thing that had been Samuel tilted its head, confused or curious, then looked past them toward the remaining houses. It opened its mouth, and the voice that emerged was layered. Samuel's voice, yes, but underneath it were others. Lily Poteet, Thomas Calloway, Amos Fletcher, every child who died from the sickness, speaking in unison. "We're awake now. We've been learning. It taught us." "What taught you?" Nadine heard herself ask, though every instinct screamed to run. The child smiled. Its teeth were too white, too many, arranged in rows. "The thing in the water? The thing they put in the water? It's been teaching us how to be different." The reactor hadn't leaked radiation. It had leaked something aware. More figures rose from the sinkhole. Adults this time. Grace Poteet, Amos Tucker, Carl Benson, others who died or disappeared over the past 3 years. They emerged in silence. standing in a loose circle around the rim, their movements synchronized. They all wore the same expression, not malicious, not blank, but deeply, terribly curious, like scientists observing an experiment. Martha Calloway, watching from behind her barricaded door, saw her son Thomas rise from the light. She pressed her hand to the window and whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't let you in." Thomas turned toward her house. He raised one hand in a wave. His fingers were too long now, joints in places joints shouldn't be. He mouthed words she couldn't hear. "It's okay, Mama. You can open the door now." She didn't. The figures from the sinkhole began to walk, not toward the living, toward the shuttered power station. They moved in formation, a procession of the dead returning to the source. As they walked, the ground beneath their feet darkened, grass withering, frost spreading in their wake despite the spring warmth. They reached the cinder block building, the door still hanging open from when the federal men had abandoned it, and filed inside one by one. Lloyd whispered, "What are they doing?" Nadine shook her head. She didn't know, but she could guess. Whatever had been tested in that building, whatever isotope or element or conscious thing had been flushed into the creek, it had changed the dead at a molecular level. It had rewritten them. And now they were going back to the place where the rewriting had begun, perhaps to finish the process, or to start it again. Minutes passed. Then the building began to glow from within, the same blue light pulsing through cracks in the concrete, growing brighter with each pulse. The hum that families had heard 3 years ago returned, but louder now, a vibration that rattled teeth and made the air taste like copper. Ezra pulled free from Lloyd and stumbled toward the power station. "Samuel! Samuel, come out of there!" The door swung shut. The hum crescendoed to a roar. Then, silence. The light went out. The building sat dark and still. Ezra reached the door and pounded on it, screaming his grandson's name. But no sound came from inside. Lloyd and Nadine dragged him away. They waited through the night. The remaining families huddled together in Nadine's house, watching the power station for any sign of movement. None came. At dawn, Lloyd and Nadine approached the building with flashlights. The door wouldn't open, not locked, but fused shut, the metal welded to the frame by heat or pressure or something neither had a name for. Lloyd kicked it. The steel buckled inward but didn't give. Through the gap, they saw nothing. Not darkness, nothing. An absence of space, as if the interior of the building had been scooped out and replaced with void. "They're gone," Nadine said. "Where?" "Somewhere we can't follow." But that wasn't quite true, because when they returned to the sinkhole, they found it had collapsed further, revealing not a shaft but a tunnel, horizontal, smooth-walled, glowing faintly at its far end. And leading into that tunnel were footprints, small ones, child-sized, pressed into stone as if the stone had been soft clay. The tunnel led northwest, toward the ridge, toward the deeper mountains, toward places no map acknowledged. They hadn't left. They'd migrated. By April of 1956, the last families left Harlan Creek on foot, carrying what they could and leaving the rest to rot. The government never came back to finish the demolition. They just cordoned the area, updated the maps, and let the forest reclaim it. Martha Calloway walked out with her 2 surviving children on April 10th. She looked back once at the house where she'd buried a husband and lost a son, at the cemetery on the ridge where the ticking had finally stopped, and made a decision that would haunt her remaining years. She would never speak of this place again. Not to her children, not to priests, Not to the census takers who would knock on her door in Louisville a decade later and ask where she'd been born. Harlan County, she'd say, and nothing more. Lloyd Tipton and Ezra Goins left together on April 12th. Ezra had spent 3 days digging at the power station door with a pickaxe, trying to reach his grandson until his hands bled and Lloyd physically carried him away. They hitchhiked to Lexington. Ezra drank himself to death within 2 years. Lloyd lived to 93 and never told anyone what he'd seen until 1998, when a hospice nurse found him crying in his sleep, whispering, "The children are still down there. They're still learning." Nadine Fletcher was the last to leave. She stayed through the end of April, documenting everything, measuring the tunnel mouth, collecting samples of the crystalline residue that now coated every surface within 100 yards of the sinkhole. She filled 6 journals with drawings, measurements, witness statements, theories. On May 1st, she sealed them in a waterproof bag, buried them at the base of a hickory tree half a mile south of the cemetery, and walked out of the hollow. She spent the next 40 years trying to get someone, anyone, to investigate. She wrote to senators, to the Atomic Energy Commission, to university researchers, to investigative journalists. Most never replied. Those who did sent polite deflections. No records existed of a power station in that location. No town named Harlan Creek appeared in federal surveys. No deaths matching her descriptions had been reported to state health authorities. In 1973, she received a visit from 2 men in suits who identified themselves as Department of Energy contractors. They asked about her journals. She told them she'd burned them. They asked if she'd kept copies. She said no. They informed her that discussing classified defense projects, even hypothetical ones, violated the Espionage Act and carried penalties, including life imprisonment. Then they left. She never spoke publicly about the hollow again, but she didn't burn the journals. And in 2009, 3 years after her death, her niece found a hand-drawn map tucked inside a recipe box. The map showed Harlan Creek in detail. Every house, every grave, the power station, the tunnel mouth. On the back, Nadine had written, "If you're reading this, I'm gone. Don't go looking for the hollow. Don't try to confirm what I saw. Some doors, once opened, should never be found again. But know this. They didn't erase the town to hide what happened. They erased it because what happened is still happening." The niece posted the map to a forum dedicated to Cold War mysteries. Within 72 hours, the thread was deleted and her account suspended. She tried again on a different platform. Same result. On the 3rd attempt, she received an email from an address that no longer exists, containing a single line. "Your aunt was wise. Be wiser." She stopped trying. What actually happened in that hollow? The official answer is nothing. No town, no incident, no cover-up. But in 2014, a hiker exploring the Daniel Boone National Forest stumbled across a depression in the ground, roughly where Nadine's map placed Harlan Creek. The trees there grew stunted and twisted. The soil tested sterile. And at the center of the depression, half buried under 40 years of leaf rot, was a cinder block foundation. 12 feet by 18 feet, anchor bolts still embedded in the concrete. A steel door frame fused shut by heat that no forest fire could generate. The hiker took photographs and GPS coordinates. He posted them online. Within a week, the thread had 400 comments, some calling it a hoax, others sharing stories their grandparents had whispered about the sick hollow or the place the government burned. 3 users claimed to have family connections to the area. 2 deleted their accounts the next day. The third, a woman named Petra Calloway, posted a single follow-up. My grandmother never talked about her childhood, but when I was 8, I found a mason jar in her cellar. Inside was a powder that glowed green in the dark. She caught me holding it and slapped it out of my hands so hard she broke my finger. Then she sat me down and said, "Some things are not for touching. Some things are not for knowing. Your brother Thomas is in a place we can't reach, and if you're smart, you'll never try." I didn't have a brother named Thomas. She'd never had a son named Thomas, or so the family Bible said. Petra never posted again. In 2019, the U.S. Geological Survey quietly updated its maps of eastern Kentucky. A 6-square-mile section of the Daniel Boone National Forest was reclassified from public recreation land to restricted access, geological instability. No signs were posted, no fences erected, just a line on a digital map that redirects GPS units away from the area and flags any permit requests for overnight camping there as denied administrative review required. Hunters still wander through. Most find nothing unusual, but every few years someone reports hearing something wrong, a ticking sound that seems to come from below the ground, rhythmic and insistent, or voices singing hymns in the middle of the night, childlike and clear, echoing from a direction they can't pinpoint, or lights in the woods, pale blue, pulsing, that vanish when approached. Local rangers have a saying, "If you hear ticking, turn around. If you see lights, run. If something calls your name, it's already too late." Whether that's folklore or operational protocol, no one will say. The Hollow remembered, and it's still teaching. Hikers who camp near the old boundary still report their watches stopping at exactly 7:13 p.m., the time Gabriel Jonathan first called to report the black opening in the sky. And some swear the stars above that patch of forest don't shine quite right, as if something between here and there bends the light just enough to notice. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.